All right, hello and welcome to our recording today. I'm talking to Dr. Vera Tarman, author of the Food Junkies book and the Sugar Free for Life Facebook group as well. And thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me today about food addiction, sugar addiction, and some of the steps that we can take to try to live an abstinent life.
Yes, thank you. I actually should have changed my name, but that's fine. Yes, I'm happy to be here, Alex. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, so I figured we'd start off by talking a little bit about, for people that are maybe new to keto or a low carb diet, or they're trying to navigate and figure out what the heck should I eat? What do I do about this situation? Can you tell us a little bit about what is food addiction?
Okay, so that's a really big question, and if we call it food addiction, you're going to have a lot of people who roll their eyes and go, "You can't be addicted to food because we have to eat food, and how can you be addicted to something that we essentially need?" And so those of us in the field really we use the word food addiction. I actually think it's a good term, but probably for somebody new to the field, it's better to say sugar addiction or processed food addiction, because that is, without question now, research is showing that there is an addictive component to foods. And, that's because the food engineers and the processed food industry have deliberately made food so that they're very addictive. And they know the buttons to press in the brain, the nucleus accumbens, dopamine. They know that, and they spend a lot of money and a lot of time in maximizing all ways to get to that addictive buzz in the brain. So it's better to say the processed food. And in fact, the people who are making the argument about what should we call this are saying, let's just call it processed food addiction. So let's start with that. What is processed food addiction? So, when we're talking about processed food, as I said, the manufacturers are deliberately making foods addictive. That does not make a person a food addict. It just makes them addicted to eating those foods because the food industry is very good at doing that. And that's, like I said, because they've learned the buttons to push. Where it becomes a problem is when, especially in today's society, where so many people are eating processed food, not just once in a while, like as a convenience because they're really tired one night or they're in a rush, but all the time. And if we really honestly left it at once in a while, like possibly my generation grew up with, I'm much older than most of the young people of today. We wouldn't really be worried about food addiction. But when we have addictive foods and we're in an environment of eating it all the time, it changes the brain, because the brain can handle the occasional slip up of a little bit of sugar, like on your birthday or maybe on a Saturday night, or at a movie. But when we're doing it every day, the brain can't do that. And it's like a person who smokes a cigarette or has a drink once in a while. They're not necessarily a smoker, but inevitably they become one if they're smoking all the time or drinking all the time. It eventually happens, and it happens with sugar and processed food too. And because of the access, we're seeing more people now with essentially chained brains because of this frequent access to processed food. So that's what we would call sugar addiction and processed food addiction. And then food addiction is a much broader term in the way that I see it, where it develops into its own entity, its own disease process, if you were, and has progressive states. And food addiction describes that whole progressive state.
Okay, so it sounds like maybe a good way to think about this is not necessarily food addiction, because if we're eating whole foods that aren't basically engineered in a laboratory to trick our brains into compulsively like overeating and craving the food, we can't really be addicted to real food. The addiction comes in when it's not actually food that we're eating. So
exactly, yeah, it's a lot of people will just say it's drug foods. It's not real food. It's drug that we eat. That's a very good way to say it. It's just drugs that we eat. But it can actually eventually, in the later stages of the disease process that I'm talking about, because I do believe that something can change at some point with constant exposure, then even healthy foods become addictive. Then people can't eat some cheeses, they can't eat nuts and stuff, whereas they could have before. But that's not early days. Early days, it usually starts with the processed food industry.
Yeah.
And
I see that a lot too, where people have a fairly abstinent life. They don't have a lot of issues with the processed food. then the problem becomes they're adding all the heavy cream to everything. They're
Mhm.
snacking on cheese all day long. They're
Yeah,
eating nuts throughout the day. And even those
yeah.
healthy foods, this is where we get into um, there's not just the substance addiction, there's also kind of a process addiction that goes with that as well, right?
Yes, yes, there's that too. And sometimes I'll call that, I mean, if that's just the process of eating, or sometimes it's the process of being full. We'll call that volume addiction. So a person eats a lot just because they need that feeling of fullness, like even over fullness. And what
Right.
the mechanisms behind that, we're not really sure. We could posit that, but it's probably not time to do that today, other than to say that that does appear to be a condition itself. Yes. But you mentioned fats and like cheeses and nuts, and often, I mean, the thing to note about that, because I know I'm speaking to a keto community now. You're a keto coach, so um, one of the things that we mentioned before we started is that a lot of people in the keto community stumble upon an abstinent plan, and they're great. Oh my God, I lost all this weight and I'm doing really well, and then something happens, I don't know, a year or 2, 3 years later, where they start reintroducing foods, and then now it doesn't work anymore. And often, if you're doing one of the things we know is that sugar and fat together is like, and especially with salt, is like the most potent of all addictiveness for foods. And when people are eating high fat and then they're introducing the taste of sweet, now it doesn't have to be sugar, it can be sweetener. It's going to fool the brain into thinking it's eating sugar, and now you've got the sugar combo, often with some salt in it, and then the high fat, and that's like, well, it's a bomb. You can call it a keto bomb, but I'm going to say that's a bomb to get off to relapse to. It's just
Right.
too much for us.
I always think about it like fireworks just absolutely lighting up in your brain, and
Yes,
you're just swept along this wild ride of like, ooh, I want that, I want that, and all these
exactly,
kind of compulsions and fixations
exactly.
really come back pretty quickly. So
If you
that's
watch them, I don't know if you've seen the movie, that Sugar film. I don't know if you've seen
yeah,
that. Have you seen it? Yeah. I don't know if you remember the scene where the guy says, here's the foods that I'm eating, and I'm going to translate them to the actual sugar that I'm eating. So if they're having an ice cream bar, they're going to have milk and then just put literally the amount of sugar that would be in that ice cream bar into it. And there's no way that somebody could actually eat that much sugar in sugar. But when you put it in the context of fat, it's very easy to do. And that's what I mean by the potency becomes enhanced with high fat, and there's where the high fat, like the keto aspect, is potentially dangerous when you start adding sweets or a little bit of sugar here and there, like in the form of honey or molasses or whatever healthy thing you want to call it. It's still sweet.
yeah. And we want to keep in mind something that I think is a sort of a nuance that's missed a lot is that we come from a background, especially in the last 70 years or so, where fat has really been demonized, and people say
Yes,
very high
yes,
in calories, it's very fattening. So
yeah,
here's one of the interesting things. If we're eating a lot of protein and we're eating a lot of fat, the satiety signal from all of that fat really kicks in. It's really registered in the brain, and we just
yes,
don't want to eat anymore. So it's
yes,
a very natural thing that the body knows how to do when it has that healthy fat intake. What's really interesting is that when we combine the fat with the sweet, we
yeah,
don't have any of that same sort of signal to stop eating. It
yeah.
signal is amplified and it says, "Oh, get more of that." So it's really interesting that fat can be that double-edged sword for sure.
Yeah, it really can. And I mean, the way that I've often seen that is like just very few people that can eat just a can of butter, like, or a quart of butter. Like they just can't eat that. But you could if you put sugar in it. You
Right.
absolutely could. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
And so
So yeah,
it's
it's
something that a lot of
double-edged.
people are, it's kind of a hard thing to explore, especially with all the marketing. We've got a lot of companies that are exposing people to a low carb type of a diet or a sugar-free type of a diet. And on one hand, this is fantastic because we need to get the message out there. We need to start attracting people. And I think it's fantastic as sort of a harm reduction model where we're saying, hey, if you're diabetic, if you're 100 pounds overweight, the cookies, the ice cream, these things are not going to be good for you. But I know
Mhm.
that you don't want to give them up. So what if you transition to using some stevia or having some keto fat bombs that are sugar free but they're still tasty? Early
Mhm.
on, that seems to be okay to kind of
Yeah,
transition and have that open mind of like, oh, maybe I can make that little step forward. We do
yeah,
see a lot of the time though that if a person is really addicted, that just kind of keeps the fire alive. And at a certain
yes,
point, if they want true freedom, like they've got to cut the ties and eat whole foods only, right?
Absolutely, but I mean, there's two reasons for that. One is that if they are on the sort of pathway towards food addiction, sweet itself, like in the form of stevia or a sweetener, is enough to trigger the desire for more sweet. So yes, you're still addicted. There's that piece. Oh my gosh, and then there was something else I was going to say, and I can't remember. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I mean, there's a
Just
lot to
dropped
this
my mind.
conversation for sure.
Yeah.
And when it comes to really identifying, am I a sugar addict? Do I have binge eating disorder? Am I an emotional eater? Do I just have a sweet tooth? What would you say is kind of the most defining factor for people that are on the fence? They're not really sure how to figure out what path of treatment to look into. What's kind of the defining characteristic for a full-blown processed food addiction or sugar addiction versus something else like binge eating?
I think probably the defining piece is like the definition of addiction is, am I obsessed to eat food despite negative consequences? And so if a person is just eating too much, and then they're forewarned because they're told they're pre-diabetic or their weight is beyond the level that they want to stay at, and they actually can moderate back, curb back, then it's like the recreational user who decides, okay, I'm going to just use less. And if they can do that, then that's fine. I still think that, I mean, they're eating addictive foods and they're still playing with fire, as it were. But they if they cut back, they're playing with less fire and they might be okay. But what we know with addiction is once there's been a neuronal adaptation, which is what happens when you're in the land of excess for too long, the brain is going to start to downregulate and you become tolerant and then dependent. That whole phenomena of addiction, once that happens, it's very hard to go back to square one. Like, I don't think you can. And so if a person says, well, how do I know? Well, can you literally moderate and just have a little bit? Or is it that the moment you have a little bit, you start to want more and then you can't stop having more, or you can't stop wanting more? I mean, you might white knuckle it and not have it, but you're still obsessed about it and it takes over mental landscape. So if that's happening, that's an indication of food addiction. Now, we could ask questions. There are questions that are to determine if you're a food addict. Like, for example, do you obsess? Are you able to control? Those are kind of the things I was suggesting. Are you doing things that are embarrassing to you, like eating food that you threw out, that you rifle through the garbage and open again? Do you eat in a way that you don't want other people to see, so you prefer to eat alone? Do you ever lie about your eating? Do you feel guilty about your eating? If you check those marks off, the check box on those, that's an indication that there's an addiction. Something's happening where you're not able to control anymore. And that's a sign of food addiction. And if I can just say, just to step away from, that's different than somebody who has a binge eating disorder or bulimia, where we believe that and the people, the clinicians in that field will say they're using food for emotional comfort. And when they can deal with the emotional distress, like meditate or cognitive therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, whatever, you deal with the distress, you don't need the food anymore. So the goal is to deal with the distress and then see if they can eat the food again, because that's not the focus. And the ideal there is, yes, they can have a little bit because they've dealt with the distress. Food addict, it doesn't matter if they're happy, sad, glad, whatever, they're not able to have even just a little bit.
Right. And I think that's a really important conversation. I think I heard you mention this before, is that a lot of the times the treatment that's offered to a person that has disordered eating is
Yes.
from the perspective of an eating disorder background, where
Yes.
a person who's anorexic by definition is like extremely restrictive of their food intake. And the way to
Yes.
treat that is to say, we have to stop restricting these foods. You need to eat calories so you don't starve to death.
Yes.
That is maybe not an appropriate approach for somebody who is morbidly obese and can't stop eating sugar. In that
Exactly.
case, restriction might make the most sense. But if we're all being treated for the same thing by the same, I guess you could call it like the same professional perspective, because this is how the DSM is structured, then the
Yes.
that's being provided for overeating and having those binge episodes is not really appropriate for the addict versus the binge eater, because
No.
not all sugar addiction looks like binge eating, but a lot of the times you'll binge on sugar and then you might think
Yes.
that it's something else. So
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
So there might be maybe a combination, and I'd love to get your opinion on this. There might be a combination of treatments that could be helpful, or a way to kind of explore and figure out what is really going to be the best path for me. And so I'm curious, what have you seen working in your experience, working with a lot of different people, working in the addiction field? What sorts of resources or support systems tend to be the most effective for people that are trying to figure out their eating habits and and trying to find peace with food?
Okay, well, I would suggest that the person speak to somebody who's not coming from an eating disorder background, first of all. And so therefore, that means right from the get-go, you're not going to get a referral from your doctor or your dietitian or your endocrinologist or your bariatric clinician. You're not, because they don't know and they don't really buy into this concept. So you're going to have to go sort of off the grid, as it were. And the keto community is a perfect place, actually, and so is the food addiction community, because we handle both sides. Like, we are aware that, like you mentioned a few seconds ago, there is an overlap. Often people start with having a binge eating disorder or appear to have one, but there's an underlying, or maybe instead of, food addiction. So the clinician needs to be aware of both possibilities. And how to figure that out, then first of all, they have to be aware of it, which you're not going to get out there in the normal world. You're going to get it in our little niche communities. And then what we want to do is have a decent way to differentiate through a diagnostic tool. And most people will use like the Yale Food Inventory or something, because they're essentially trying to figure out, is this a person who's a bulimic or somebody who's a food addict? Or at least, what's the likelihood? Because if it's clearly a binge eater, I'm not going to suggest all of the restrictions that I would suggest for food addiction. I don't want to wish that on anybody if they don't need it. Because sometimes it will include, like if it's a binge eater, weighing and measuring food. That might not be what a binge eater should be doing. They should be doing something else, like dealing with their distress. But once we figured out, okay, I think this is a food addict, then what do? You will, depending on where you are on the stage, most likely the person, almost everybody, will either do in a harm reduction way, which you suggested, or in a cold turkey way. So you got to quit you have to identify and quit the trigger foods. Almost always sugar, almost always carbohydrates. So we can almost go with a surety that it's those two, but it might be more. And the goal is abstinence. Maybe not immediate abstinence, but it's abstinence. You got to quit those things to get a clear mind, free the obsession, let the brain recalibrate itself. That's number one. Well, number one is diagnosis and talking to the right clinician. Then number two is getting that concept of abstinence down. And then number three is, how do I live? Because I've lived all my life, or many of my life, through difficult issues with food. How do I live without those foods? And that's where we talk about how you need to have community and support. And I mean, that's where the Facebook groups come in. That's where the coach comes in, the therapist comes in, is to help the person stay sober. And I think those things are crucial. It's not just about the food. The food is number one, but then you have to move on to number two, which is getting basically, how do I stay sober now that I'm sober?
Yeah, that makes sense. So to do a bit of a recap, stage one would probably be the diagnosis and working with somebody who's food addiction aware and sensitive to that can really kind of give you some guidance on what to do. Stage two would be to start looking into, how can I address my physiology, that the brain chemistry that's been betraying me and sort of like activating the inner food monster.
Yes.
Do I need to do harm reduction, or do I need to just cold turkey abstain?
Yeah. And also figure out what your trigger foods are too, because yours are going to be different than mine.
Right. And so there's a bit of a customization process that we have to go into. And a lot of people are still in this phase and have been for years of like, how do I nail down like what is right for me? And that's going to be a very important key piece of the puzzle to long-term abstinence, and ultimately really like weight maintenance and health maintenance, because we've seen swing up into 100 pounds.
And if a person doesn't want to go through all that and just say, this is just too complicated, just help me, I would say, then, you know what does work is like a keto plan that's like I don't want to say severe extreme, but like 20-30 grams of carbs, and that's it. And you stay there, like that will work. It's just, you may not have to be that extreme, but that will work. If you don't want to go through all the rigmarole of what we're suggesting, whatever worked for you at the beginning, which was probably that, stay with it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there are always going to be those people that they don't really They don't really like the 12-step process. They don't really want
Yeah.
to have a coach. They don't want to go to therapy twice a month. They just want to like do a diet and go exercise and try to lose weight. And that's kind
Yeah.
of their focus. And the
Yeah.
thing there is that if you just do a keto diet and you're very strict with it, a lot of people will lose weight and keep it off, and they might never realize that they're a food addict. It just worked.
Yeah.
And it just keeps.
Exactly, exactly. And as long as they're probably getting their support, quote, as it were, through, YouTube, or podcast videos, all that kind of stuff to sort of keep them sort of on the wagon, as it were, because of course there's always going to be the calls to eat crappy stuff out there, because that's what the food industry wants you to fall off the wagon. But they're probably like, we do need to have something, some kind of protective bubble away from the calls of the wild, as it were. And the keto community is very strong. It does that without you even realizing it. Yeah.
That's true. And I think we see that in a lot of different communities where a group identity becomes part of who we are. So
Yeah.
some people do this with vegan, some people do this with CrossFit, some people do
Yeah.
this with keto, some people
Uh-huh.
do this by identifying as an addict and embracing service. But all of
Yes.
these things are a way to really buy in and to really take seriously that lifestyle and that community that you want to be a part of. And so
Yeah.
having an approach versus a more isolated approach, it sounds like that dealing with the food, dealing with the physiology, having an abstinence plan is the foundation that gets your brain right so that you can get out of isolation, make rational choices, and be able
Yes.
to sort of do the deeper work of figuring out like how do I make my way in this world when I don't have food to numb myself. That's kind of the ongoing part that tends to be pretty much required if you want to truly maintain all of the weight loss, all of the health benefits long term, and not kind of go back and forth relapsing and saying, oh, I better recommit to keto and lose 20 pounds and then relapsing. At a certain
Yeah.
point, you are a food addict. You have to find a way to live with abstinence and embrace it.
Yes. Yes. And we have to say in here that if you do learn to live with it and embrace it, it's not like you're living in a land of deprivation and thinking all the time about all those foods that you don't get to eat anymore. It's actually like, oh my God, I love having the food that I'm going to have tonight. Like your
Right.
taste buds will change, and you'll actually come to love the food that you're eating. Like there is actually a process of returning back to innocence, as it were, to before the food industry polluted our taste buds.
Yeah. And that's an important thing to remember is that
Yeah.
for the first couple days or couple weeks, it feels really hard. And that little gremlin in your brain is saying, you can't do it. You got it. You can't live like this.
Yeah.
For a while, that voice gets quieter and you start
Yeah.
to, your taste buds change. Regular, normal, whole foods taste really good. And you don't feel like you're cutting off your leg. You feel like you're pulling a thorn out of your foot.
Yeah.
And
It's great.
it feels like freedom rather than sacrifice, right? And once we
Yeah.
can do that and embrace that, that's one of those pieces that I think is missing for a lot of people is that they go into this kind of begrudgingly, like, oh, I guess I have to do something about my weight. I have to give up these foods that I love. But really
Yes.
counting the minutes until we can have a cheat meal. Versus
Yeah.
this stuff doesn't serve me. And I'm actually really excited to have this new lifestyle and to be free of that stuff.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I'm not that exactly, and the reason why I'm not that fond about these sort of keto little treats that have been slipping in, is that it reminds people of what they're missing because it looks like it. It's a keto cheesecake that reminds me of the cheesecake I used to have, and you're back to that. You're not going to get into the love of just having a piece of cheddar cheese, which is in itself enough, but it's not enough when you've got a cheesecake on your mind.
Very true. So
Keto like or not.
relearning how to be okay with sort of what historically or in terms of our human evolution, like just falling in love with the foods that our ancestors would have eaten, falling in
Yes.
love with a lifestyle that we would have had before, modern times and all the stresses and all of the rush and all the processed stuff that's really been poisoning us as a country and as a modern society. That can really help to embrace that new lifestyle and not feel like you're missing out. So this has been really good. And I took a couple of notes that I can share in the groups as well. And before we go for today, do you have any like events coming up or anything that you're working on that you'd like to share about?
Okay, well, I would like people to know about my book, Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction, just so that, because I think it's a very good primer. If you're interested in this area, it's very readable and it'll introduce you to the area. And if I can say that we have a Facebook group, pardon me, well, we have that too. We have a podcast that's based on the book. So we interview people in the book, and then all the people of today, whoever's willing to talk to us, we'll get them. And then I have a Facebook group too, like you do, that's basically sugar and food addiction. And I guess my latest project is that I'm very excited about is I'm doing a lot of YouTube videos now. I'm starting on addiction itself because I'm an addictions doctor, just like, how do I know I'm an alcoholic and that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to move more and more into food addiction as well. So if people like watching YouTube, check out my channel.
Awesome. Okay, so we got the Food Junkies book, we've got the Food Junkies podcast, the Sugar Free for Life Facebook group, and then also your YouTube channel. So I'll get links for those and I'll put them in the notes for later. And
Excellent.
also,
Thank
I
you.
will also announce that I'm going to give away 3 copies of Food Junkies to people that want to learn a little bit about this. And I can send them like an Amazon gift card, or I can send that book to them. So for anybody watching the recording, just send me a message, ketocoachalex@gmail.com, or you can post in the comments and tag me. And I'm going to do a raffle over the weekend where I'm going to give out 3 copies of that. And we'll do that for people in my group and your group and just whoever opts into the giveaway there. Because I think this is really important information. People need to learn this stuff, at the very least to consider it in their journey, trying to figure out what's going to work for them. So I want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk and to share your expertise on all of this. And I hope it really helps some people that are getting started on this journey and just need a little bit of clarity and a little bit of support.